So far what we've learned about is Keser and Chochmah. And then we said we were going to start Binah. And then we got back into Chochmah when we said we were going to start Binah. So now we can really talk about what Binah is. So if you had to translate Binah, how would you translate it? Okay, so I was going to get to that in a second. So first, the actual meaning of the word Binah. How do people translate? Understanding, right? Binah is understanding. And then, as you pointed out, it's linked to the word for building, for construction, which is the word boine, right? In fact, we even have the expression Chochmas Isha Bon Sa Beisa, that the wisdom of a woman builds her home. And we know that Binah Yasera, that women have additional Binah. So there's that link between Binah, which is understanding, and Binyan, which is construction. They're not exactly the same word, but there is an overlap and there's a connection between them. So let's try and start this first from human experience, because it's always easier for us to explore how things are within ourselves, because that's familiar. And then once we understand how things work internally, from that we can try and understand how they work on a spiritual level. Okay? So on a personal level, let's just go back. On a personal level, what does Chokhmah feel like? What does Chokhmah look like? How do you know when you're experiencing a Chokhmah? It's that flash, right? It's that flash of awareness, of insight, of innovation, of understanding. Okay, understanding is a hard word, right? Because we just said Binah is understanding. So let's leave that out. But it's a moment of clarity. That's essentially what we've said about Chokhmah. It's a moment of clarity. And we've also identified that the irony of Chokhmah is, while it feels like a moment of clarity, it is impossible to express that clarity to anybody else. So we need to understand why that is, because that's going to be critical for appreciating what Binah does. Okay? So the principle is that when you have a Chokhmah moment, it feels blinding, it feels overwhelming, it feels absolutely brilliant, it's inspiring, it's amazing, and again, it comes with a certain aspect of clarity, and yet at the same time, you can't really explain it to anybody else. So let's try to come up with a metaphor to represent that initial moment of Chokhmah. What would be a metaphor to represent it? And there could be more than one, by the way. Let's try, yeah? Flash. Okay, great. We're going to go with that, a flash of lightning. So imagine that you're at home and it's at night, so you've turned off the lights, and there's one of those major high-felt storms. And every few seconds, there's this flash of lightning. And just imagine that while that storm is happening, there's a child in your home who's scared of the thunder, right? And so they arrive at your door, and they want to come and be consoled and made to feel safe in the middle of the storm. So you open up the door and they start walking in. And as they're walking in from the door of the room until they get to you, there's a few flashes of lightning. So you effectively see them and then you see them again. You know what I'm saying? Like the first flash of lightning illuminates them at the door, and the next flash of lightning illuminates them a few meters in. And so effectively what happens is, in between flashes of lightning, you're in the dark. You actually have no idea where exactly they are, right? Whereas each flash of lightning gives you this momentary clarity. And that's exactly the point. That's why it's an excellent metaphor to use to represent Chokhmah, is this flash of lightning, because it's exactly that. It's this momentary clarity, but it's very, very brief. When we say momentary, we really mean that it's really, really brief. And that's why often when we have those flashes of inspiration or those momentary ideas, if we don't pay attention to them, we could lose them completely, because once the flash is over, the flash is over. But there's another implication of using this lightning metaphor, and that is it could actually be blinding in the moment. It could be so intense that you're left kind of startled, and perhaps not only are you in the dark because the lightning was so short, but you could actually be in the dark because your eyes are temporarily blinded, from this very intense flash of light. And that's very much what's happening in the realm of Chokhmah, is you've got this very intense experience of light that's just been shared. And because it's so intense, it is not only transient, but it could actually be overwhelming. It could actually be blinding in the moment. And that's why when, for example, let's say that a person is introduced to an idea for the very first time, not only does it feel like, wow, that was brilliant, it could also feel like, wow, that was overwhelming. And that's often when people say, I need to hear that again. I need to revisit that because it was just blinding in its impact and its depth and its profundity. So I need to hear it again. Now let's compare that to the experience of Binah. Again, we're just right now talking at the most introductory level about how it is in the human experience. And then based on that, we'll use that to understand the spheres themselves. So let's just talk in the human experience for a moment. What's the difference between Chokhmah and Binah? Now that we've described that Chokhmah is this incredible, powerful, blinding, inspiring experience. So what then is Binah? Where does Binah start? What does Binah look like? For example, the person's just had this brilliant inspiration, or the person's just heard an idea that is brand new for them and completely overwhelming. So what does Binah now look like? Where does it start? How does it start? What do you do? What is Binah?
Is it translating that thought into action?
No, it's got nothing to do with action. We're way too soon for action. We're way early in the process. It's going to have to go through various evolutions till eventually we get to action. We're not there yet. Okay, understanding, right? So now let's talk about what understanding is. Because it's easy for us to throw out the word and just anticipate that we all understand, excuse the pun, that we all understand what understanding is. But what is necessary in order to be able to understand something? What are there's certain key components that we have to have in order to be able to understand. Process, right? There has to be a process, absolutely. So there has to be a process, and the process has to follow some kind of an order. It has to be some kind of a rational process. True. So there has to be a process. Okay, so what would go into that process? In other words, if you're trying to understand something, or you're trying to assist another person to be able to understand something, what do you have to do in order to allow them to understand, or in order to allow yourself to understand? And we don't have to have this in chronological order at this point in time. Let's just put the components together. What are you going to do? Okay, so you're going to take a piece of it. But at that moment of Chokhmah, when it's just this blinding reality, I don't have pieces yet. Okay? Now, that is part of the process. I'm not disagreeing. It is part of the process. At some point, you're going to have to take a piece and focus on that piece. And in order to get there, what are you going to have to do? Calculate. Calculate what?
What to do with that.
Okay, so now you're saying, what do I do with this information? That's perhaps already a little bit further down the line, because I have to understand what the information is before I could talk about what do I do with this information. But how do I begin to understand something? Again, let's put ourselves into the shoes of somebody who's trying to explain to somebody else, because usually when we're trying to explain to somebody else, it's easier for us to identify the method than when we're just trying to understand something ourselves, because often we try and understand without knowing a method necessarily. So let's try to think, what do we need to do in order to...
Accept. I'm saying...
Accept what?
Kind of...
So what are we accepting?
So there's a blinding flash of Chokhmah.
Of Chokhmah, right?
And then there has to be acceptance that this idea exists.
Fine, good. Okay, great. So the first thing, so perhaps a slightly different way to say the same thing is there has to be an acknowledgement, almost to acknowledge this happened. Acknowledge this exists. This information exists. Great. Now, let's turn this into a very relatable experience. Okay, what's a relatable experience? You hear a speaker, or you read a book, or you listen to a podcast, and in that speech or book or podcast, you encounter something that for you is absolutely like, wow, this is just wow. You know, I can't believe what I've just written kind of thing. And then shortly after that, you either come home and you're speaking to a family member, come home and speak to your husband, let's say, or somebody phones you shortly after, a good friend phones you. You're like, you can't believe what I've just heard. Now, what happens next? you tell the person, I've just read the most amazing thing, I've just heard the most amazing thing, I've just learned the most amazing thing. What happens next? You try to explain it. And then? You're disappointed, right? And they're disappointed because why? Because is it that you can't remember?
No, you can't.
Sometimes it is that you can't remember, and I accept that. But sometimes you can't give it over, right? So you do actually remember it, but you can't give it over. Why can't you give it over?
It's out of that initial space.
Correct. Okay, so what does it feel like? What's going on inside our brains at that point where we are so on fire, but we can't actually explain it?
We've lost that moment of clarity.
So we've lost the clarity. That's true. And I want to just before we talk about emotion, I just want to talk about clarity for a second. Is it always that we've lost the clarity? In other words, is it possible to have clarity and still not be able to explain it? What does it mean I can't access? Okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? So there's that frustration because I have this clarity and it feels absolutely clear and it's inspiring and it's overwhelming and it's beyond my reach all at the same time. Koyach ma, right? There's power over there, but ma, it's kind of undefined. So what's happening? Just describe. What does it feel like inside? What does it feel like? It's not diluted. It's not diluted. But what's the frustration? What did you say? Confused. What's the confusion? Disconnect between
what you know as true.
Right.
To bring it out.
Okay, so there's a disconnect between what you're seeing so clearly and being able to interpret what you're seeing. Okay, now we're getting something. Okay, let's use an example. So what we often do when we speak about Chokhmah is we associate Chokhmah with vision. Visual perception and auditory perception are two very different processes. So let's try and distinguish between what the visual and auditory experiences are, because that's going to help us understand the fundamental difference between Chokhmah and Binah. So when I have a visual experience, I don't necessarily know yet what I've experienced, even though it's absolutely clear that I'm experiencing it. So for example, let's use an example that I think we can all relate to. Let's say that you travel to some absolutely exquisite part of the natural world. So it could be a canyon or a mountain or a forest or a beach, something that's absolutely beautiful. So everybody, I'm sure, has their place that they imagine or that they have been to, this is it. This is my absolute beautiful place, okay? So I'm just going to use a random example. You go hiking in the Drakensberg to the amphitheater, right? Okay, there we go, right? So, and you're standing, and you could do this either way. You could either be standing at the bottom looking up at the amphitheater, you could be standing at the top looking down at the incredible vistas that you could see in the rolling hills, and it's absolutely amazing, right? And pulled at that exact time, you get on the phone, and you're trying to describe to your best friend what you're seeing. It's a highly frustrating experience because it's not possible, right? And that's why they had postcards once upon a time, right? What was the point of the postcard? Because I can't really describe to you what it is. So I'm just going to buy a snapshot. And obviously now in the digital age, ask a child today what a postcard is. They have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, right? But because now they're just streaming this thing like in real time, which kills the experience on both sides of the streaming, but that's subject for another conversation. So let's assume that technology doesn't exist and you can't immediately WhatsApp pictures and you can't live stream your thing. So you're actually describing over the phone, or worse, you've now come back and you're describing. But I want to show the extreme difference between the visual and auditory experience. So you're standing there watching this majestic scene. Is there anybody who has the words to describe it? Limitations of language, right? But even if, let's just assume you didn't have that limitation. Let's just assume that you were really gifted and you've got this incredible capability to describe things in the most vivid way. At the end of the day, even if you could describe it in the most vivid way, at the end of the day, what's going to happen is the person on the other end, there'll be one fundamental difference between your experience and theirs. Besides all the technicalities of the limitations of language and whether or not they understand what you're describing, because of course a person listens through their own filter rather than hearing what you're trying to say. But besides all of that, there's one fundamental difference between the visual and the auditory experience, which is how long does it take you to see the scene? It takes a millisecond to see the scene. And how long would it take you to describe the scene?
Lost in translation.
That's a different concept. Lost in translation is a different concept. This is a fundamental difference between a process that is instantaneous versus a process that is, in fact, a process, which implies time. So let's go back. Chokhmah is an instantaneous experience. It's that moment, and that moment might be less than a second, of realization, of innovation, of insight. It's an instantaneous experience. You cannot, forget about the other people. We'll talk about dealing with other people. Internally, you cannot fully appreciate an instantaneous experience. You cannot fully appreciate an instantaneous experience. It's breathtaking, right? But it doesn't mean I fully appreciate it. Because if it were that I could fully appreciate an instantaneous experience, I would climb to the top of the amphitheater, take a look around, and go home. But we don't do that. We stop and we revel in the experience. And if we do it properly, we actually allow ourselves to take it in through all the senses, not just visually. You listen to the silence. You feel, if there is, right? If there is. So you take in various elements of what's happening. And by the way, as your eyes adjust, you start noticing things you did not notice initially in the first experience, which basically means what's happening? What am I shifting from that initial breathtaking moment, which is symbolic of Chokhmah, to the next phase? What's changing? I'm going, to use language that we use in like Talmudic expression, I'm going min haklal el haprat. Min haklal, from the overall general perspective, el haprat, into specifics. If you want to understand something, you need detail. You need specifics. When people don't understand things, that's when they tend to be general. So, like we used to joke in yeshiva days, we used to joke that when you went to somebody for Shabbos, they would always ask you to say something at the table. Share a Dvar Torah or something like that. So often a person would, in the course of their Dvar Torah, whatever it is that they were saying, they'd use this expression, the whole idea is. And we'd always joke that if a person says the whole idea is, they have no idea what they're talking about. Why? Because if I'm talking the whole idea, then essentially what you're saying is, I've got the klal, I've got the general picture, which means I don't really understand. Because if I understood, I would know the detail. I wouldn't be saying the whole idea is, I'd saying there's so many facets of this idea.
So it's Binah that understand the detail.
So here we go. So to cross over from Chokhmah to Binah means to cross over from seeing this visual, overwhelming, breathtaking experience of clarity, which is a visual clarity, into drilling down into the detail. What does that actually mean? And that's why we battle. When we go home after being inspired by a shiur, or by a talk, or by a podcast, or something that we've read, the reason that we battle to transfer it to anybody else, and the reason we battle to translate it into our own lives, is because we haven't yet unpacked the detail. You can't work with something unless you know those details. So let's use this as an example. Let's say that somebody had to get up and suggest a solution to the shidduch crisis. Okay, they'd be making lots of money, right? So somebody gets up and they say, I've got this brilliant idea, and the problem with the shidduch crisis is X. And everybody's like, wow, we never thought of that. That is brilliant. That's the issue. What's going to happen after that? What's going to change? Nothing. Because it doesn't help to have that single flash of inspiration. It's like, and now what does that mean? What does that mean to these particular people who are trying to help individuals find their shidduchim? What does it mean to those people who are struggling to find their shidduchim, right? We need to actually detail. We have to unpack this thing. The same thing, if somebody had to, for example, get up and tell us, let's use an example we can all relate to. Somebody get up and tell us one of the key things about being Jewish is keeping Shabbos. Oh my gosh, what an amazing, I never thought of this before. One day out of the week, you just power down, you don't use your devices, you spend time with your family. This is brilliant. I'm going to tell the whole world that we should keep Shabbos. We're like, okay, that's great, but until you understand what that actually means, you can't keep Shabbos. You could do your own little 24-hour personal vacation, but that's got nothing to do with Shabbos. You have to get the details so that you understand what this means. You understand what it includes. You understand how it operates. We cannot understand things without detailed information. And that's the problem, unfortunately, that many people have, especially in today's world. They grab sound bites and think they understand issues. That's probably one of the greatest problems we face in today's world. Everybody's willing to shoot their mouth off because they saw something on a TikTok and now they believe they understand the entire complexity of the Middle East and they are qualified to comment on who you should be supporting in this conflict. They have no detail, they have no context, they have no nuance, so therefore they understand nothing. So in order for a person to be able to understand, we need detail. That's the first point. What were you going to say?
So I was just going to say also, like, in terms of you have that inspiration, you know it's the truth. You also then have to sort of translate it into your will to do it.
We're getting there.
Is that also like...
Can't do that without detail. No, I agree with you. You need to be able to obviously make this personal and applicable. You cannot personalize something that doesn't have detail. In other words, here's a simple, again, another example that we can all relate to. Person says, that's it, the diet starts tomorrow. Okay? So you know what happens? What's the problem? What's the problem with that statement? There's no plan. There's no detail. It's just a general statement. Okay, tomorrow, the billionaire status starts tomorrow. You may as well say the same thing. Because there's no detail, there's no context, there's no plan. Whereas if the person says, tomorrow I will start reducing my sugar intake by X, that's detail. It's relatable. It's doable. Okay, so that's already the level of doing action. We're not at the level of action yet. But a similar kind of thing applies to understanding. If we don't have detail around something, we cannot understand something. Now, detail is not good enough because we know very well that you can overwhelm people with details. So that's exactly. So let's go to the opposite extreme, right? So the first version is, I've got this amazing thing. You should keep Shabbos. It's going to change your life. Okay, what does it mean to keep Shabbos? All right. Let me sit you down and start telling you every kind of muktzah that exists. So you overwhelm the person with detail. It doesn't help. It doesn't help just to throw detail at people. So we need something which is really, really critical, which only once we think about it do we see doesn't really exist in the world of Chokhmah and is very much the template for the world of Binah. What do we need? We need not just to edit. Let's talk about that for a second. Not just to edit. Let's use a different word to imply similar message. You need to prioritize. Very good. So prioritize, which essentially means we have to filter. Filter. Okay. So priority is one kind of filtering. Editing is another kind of filtering. Categorizing is a filter. It's really, really important. So, for example, if I'm trying to understand something, I do need to have some hierarchy in my own mind of which things do I need to understand first, which are the foundational principles. Once I understand the foundational principles, then I can build on those and eventually get to the details. Whereas if I just start with the details and I don't understand the foundational principles, again, the details are going to overwhelm me. So the process of understanding something is very much a process of intellectual discipline. Because without intellectual discipline, I can't prioritize, I can't edit, I can't filter, I can't create a chronological process, and then I can't understand. So Chokhmah is hugely inspiring, but not very disciplined. And again, we know this from our own experience. When we get a flash of inspiration, when we have a brand new idea, that's not a very disciplined moment. That's a very effusive moment. Like, wow, we're just like, we don't know where to put ourselves. This is so exciting. We could actually behave in a way that's, in retrospect, a little bit embarrassing.
That's more emotional.
Not emotion. This is not emotion. This is overwhelm. There's a big difference between an emotional experience, which we'll still get to, and an overwhelming experience. Not all overwhelming experiences are emotional. It's just overload. There's too much here. There's too much brilliance. I'm being blinded by the light. So if you had to, for example, hang out with creative people, you can expect a lot of these eruptions because they're creative people. They're having a lot of chokhmahs. That's wow, like everything's very exciting. So you go, for example, to an ad agency, expect that there's going to be a lot of fun stuff happening and a lot of creativity and probably not a whole lot of discipline. They're going to have an element of the agency that creates workflow and budgets and timelines, whatever, because the creatives, that's not their world. Whereas if you had to walk into a research facility, you're not going to hear a whole lot of, every once in a while you get a eureka, but the vast majority of the time they're plodding along, busy putting this sample over there and cataloging this and doing that point of research and indexing and comparing and experimenting. It's not an overly exciting environment as much as we'd like it to be.
So we need to combine the two.
Well, that we're going to talk about the combination. That we're not there yet. Now we're just trying to understand what they are. So Binah, what does it mean to build something? To build something means you have to have a plan. You can't just build something. You have to have created architectural drawings. You need perhaps an engineer. You need who's going to put in all the services. When you build something, it's got to be done with discipline and with structure. So when you're trying to build a concept out of its original explosive seed of origin, you need a process. Here's an example we can all relate to. When Hashem gave the Torah at Mount Sinai, what kind of an experience was that? Was that a chokhmah or a binah moment for the Jewish people? Complete chokhmah, right? How do we know? Because it was divine revelation. They had a visual experience that was so blinding and overwhelming that the Gemara tells us everybody was flung back the full distance of their camp, which is like 12 kilometers, and their neshamas were blown out of their bodies because it was complete overwhelm. This is not an emotional experience. This is an overload. There's just too much holiness, too much light. It's the container cannot handle it. But let me just finish the thing. And then what happens? And then they say to Moshe, you have to speak to us because we can't handle this. We need you to speak to us. And although Moshe tells them the rest of the 10 commandments, right, 8 out of the 10 commandments, that's not the point. The point is Moshe then spends the rest of his life going through this process with them in a very detailed, disciplined, intellectual, intentional way until eventually they get to understand the Torah. So 40 years in the desert is essentially a chokhmah launch at Sinai into a binah prolonged experience for the rest of the time in the desert. And by the way, the number 40 is also not accidental because we know, what does it say? Ben arboim. When a person is 40 years old, what does the Mishnah say? Le binah. That's when a person begins to understand. So it's no accident that they have these 40 years in the desert, even though we can blame the spies. But the reality is that allows them this binah, this full, mature understanding of what it is that they've been given at the time of the giving of the Torah. And that's essentially what's going on in all of our lives all of the time, is that we get ideas and then either we build on those ideas in a mature way with discipline, intellectual discipline, or we lose those ideas. Or what we might, and this does happen for some people, what happens is we kind of just wait for the next inspiration to hit. So we don't really have a plan for our lives. We're just always thirsty for the next inspiration. And if it comes, great, then I'm okay. And if it doesn't come, then I feel a little bit unstable. And what's my Judaism going to rely upon? Whereas what should be happening is we should be creating a binah process. We should be creating a process of learning and understanding and integrating what it is that we've learned, which might, besides anything else, talk to why we say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, that a person has to be learning Torah all the time because we've got to constantly flesh it out and get more insight and more structure and more maturity to our understanding of our Judaism. Because if it's just going to be generic and if it's just going to be sound bites, and if it's just going to be flashes of inspiration, that's not a sustainable version of Judaism. Now that's the human experience. That's the human experience. So until a person has a sense of binah, they really have no handle on a topic. And we can always easily identify a person who doesn't have mature binah, because effectively, whenever they come back to the topic, they effectively just tell us the same things again and again and again, but at a very superficial level, without any real depth. They can't have any meaningful debate. They feel very insecure in their position, because until a person has binah, they really have nothing. A seed that isn't fertilized cannot grow, and a spark that doesn't ignite a fire is wasted energy, And so a chokhmah that does not translate into a binah is effectively impotent.
And I'm going to say, I was going to say it's exactly, we've got that formula. So it starts with a will, and then it goes to thought, and then it goes to formation, and then it goes to creation.
Okay, so the only thing we have to be very clear about over here is we haven't said the word thought yet.
Okay.
None of this is yet the concept of thought. Okay, it's really important to understand that, because thoughts can be very superficial. They don't necessarily have to have depth. We're thinking all the time. Most of the things that we're thinking about are very mundane and arbitrary things. Here we're talking about the intellectual process. The intellectual process essentially means the wiring of our brains, and we can improve our intellectual process so a person can train and they can become more Binah oriented, and then they can become more capable at their Binah. And yes, you will use thought to process the intellectual process, but thought does not equal intellect. It's really important to know that. Thought is a tool, whereas intellect is the real depth of the experience. Okay, it's really important for us to know.
Are there people who can achieve total Binah?
Are there people who can achieve total Binah? The question, just to come from a different angle, is there such a thing as total Binah? Okay, so if you're talking, let's say, about something which is finite, then it is possible to have total Binah, and then people can achieve total Binah. So you could have somebody who's an expert in a particular area of the natural sciences, let's just say, and they have complete Binah of that particular science, like maths. Maths is not going to change. It's not going to, it's not going to be that at some point in the future they're going to introduce a new concept of mathematics. Mathematics is what the Rambam calls an absolute science, and so it's always going to be objectively the same. And so a person could have absolute Binah with regards to mathematics, right? And the same that the Rambam says about astronomy. Astronomy is also not going to change. It's not that at some point the way that planets behave is going to fundamentally shift. So once you understand astronomy, you can have absolute Binah about astronomy. All the other world sciences are evolving, as we know, right? Because we're constantly discovering more and more about the world, and so therefore it's not possible that a person could have absolute Binah, because there's more that we might still discover. And when it comes to Torah, Torah is infinite. So not only can a human never have full Binah of the Torah, but full Binah of the Torah by definition cannot exist, because Torah is infinite, and Binah by definition, as we are learning now, is a process of creating finite channels. And that's probably the last part of our conversation for now, which is, if I'm talking detail, and if I'm talking process, and if I'm talking structure, then I'm effectively saying finite. So the value of Binah is, it takes the idea that was previously abstract and makes it real for me. So the benefit to me is, now I can understand the idea. On the other hand, the idea originally was in its most pristine abstract form, which was beyond the scope of the human brain, and I've now had to downgrade it to some extent to be able to understand it. Which means, if I'm dealing with earth sciences, those are fundamentally finite things because they belong to a fundamentally finite reality. So at some point, maybe the human being can get to full understanding. When I'm talking about divine wisdom, when I'm talking about Hashem's wisdom, every single time I understand something, there's absolute benefit to me because I have clarity and maturity, and there's naturally a downgrading of the material because the material is not intended to be captured by the human brain. It's intended to be infinite. So we've got to bear that in mind, right? There's a bit of a double-edged sword over here when it comes to understanding anything relating to Hashem. The better we understand it, the further we are from the source. Okay? Still more to unpack on that particular topic, but I'm just throwing that out there. So if we had to put what we've learned so far, which is we've learned so far about something called Keser, we've learned about something called Chokhmah, and we've learned about something called Binah. So we said that Keser is something which is completely beyond the entire system. And Keser will describe how something exists at its most, shall we say, pristine level, which is way beyond anything we can access. So from the concept's perspective, that's the best it can be. That's the best it can be. It's completely undefined, it's completely abstract, it's completely pristine. We then called Chokhmah Yesh Me'ayin. Yesh means there's a handle, there's something I can perceive. There's some level of awareness, there's some level of clarity for me. That means the concept has now been slightly downgraded, because before it was beyond grasp, which means it was truly infinite, and now it is accessible, which means it's got some finite element to it. But for me, the human being, it's nowhere near something workable or usable, because it's still just this brilliant flash that I can't express, that I can't really understand. So in a sense, you could say that Chokhmah is like somewhere in between the pristine version of where this idea started and then how I'm going to experience it as a human being. Binah is what we call Yesh Mi Yesh. The idea now exists in my brain. I had the idea. I learned I read the book. I learned this new concept. I heard the talk. The idea now exists in my brain. It is already Yesh. Previously, it was Ayin. It was not part of my reality. I didn't know about it. I was completely in the dark. It meant absolutely nothing to me. It was outside of my range of experience. It was beyond anything I could understand. And now I've got the flash. Yesh, there is now this flash of brilliance sitting in my brain. But that flash of brilliance is not yet usable. I need to flesh it out. I need to give it 3 dimensions. That's what Binah is going to help me to do. So it's Yesh, Mi Yesh. I'm taking the existing material and I'm turning it into something usable. I'm taking the seed and I'm planting it. I'm taking the spark and igniting a fire. That's what Binah does. For that reason, the truest link between Binah and Binyan, between the concept of Binah, which is understanding, and the concept of Binah, which is construction, is not in the human experience. The human experience is the metaphor. It's in the divine experience. Hashem creates using 10 sephiros. That's actually what we're trying to learn about, right? And we're just using the human being as a metaphor to understand how Hashem's creative process works. So in order for Hashem to create existence like we know it, these same 3 steps are going to be required. The first step is there's a keser, which we've translated right at the beginning. Keser equals ratzon. There has to be a will. There has to be a motivation. Hashem has to have the interest to create. Now, in Hashem's case, it's a little different to us, or maybe vastly different to us, because for us, if we have a ratzon, it's because it's very personal to us. Why do I have a ratzon? Why do I want X and Y in my life? Because it really means a lot to me. Whereas in Hashem's case, Hashem generates a ratzon, not because it's personal to him, because Hashem doesn't need anything. Hashem's not lacking. Hashem is perfect as is. And yet, Hashem chooses to instigate a ratzon. Okay, so that's really, really different to our experience. What's the ratzon? The ratzon is that there should be a created reality, and then there should be a purpose to that reality. But first of all, let's say Hashem wants to have a created reality. So therefore, he launches a chokhmah. What's the chokhmah? The concept of existence in its most abstract, unformed state. Let there be light. Right at the beginning of the Torah, let there be light. And even Rashi points out, and Rashi is the simplest interpretation, that right at the beginning of creation, everything is created. And then over the subsequent 6 days that follow, everything is extracted from that original seed into the specifics of the earth and the sea and the stars and the sun and the moon and the animals and the plants, etc., right? But everything is launched in this original Yehi Or, let there be light. What's light? The blinding flash of Chokhmah. That's what's happening right at the beginning of creation. Hashem is introducing this concept of existence. Now, what does existence mean? What does existence look like? What are the details of existence? To be advised, right? That hasn't yet happened. That's just the original Chokhmah, the original brilliance of what the scientific world tries to describe and calls a big bang. Now, of course, what they refer to as a big bang and what Yehi'or refers to are completely different, but bear in mind that everything that exists in the world must have a spiritual source. So the fact that science uses that kind of terminology must track back to something spiritual, which is exactly that. There's this original flash, Yehi'or, that this great blinding light of Hashem's power that is going to now translate into existence. At that point in time, nothing exists in a way that we could identify. That means there's no world, there's no heaven, there are no 10 sephiros. None of that exists yet. There's just chokhmah. There's just that brilliant idea. Again, the first time that I have that flash of brilliance, that new idea, either that I've learned or that I've thought of, at that point, there's just the brilliance. None of it really exists. How do I know it doesn't exist? Because if I get distracted, I'm going to forget that brilliant idea. So it tells me it doesn't really exist. So there is yesh, there's the possibility of existence, but if I don't translate this into something detailed and structured and mature, it's all going to disappear. So why do we associate Binah with the word boineh, which is related to binyan, construction? Because it's only because it's only when you get to the Binah level that you start building the spheros. You start building the details of existence. Again, in the same way as in my own intellectual experience. It's only once I start the Binah process, which means I start to identify the details. What are the foundational principles? What are the subcategories? What are the absolute specifics? Only once I start to do that do I begin to truly understand something, and it takes form in my mind. And now it's not just this flash of brilliance, but it's a fully fledged intellectual process. In the same way, in order for Hashem to create existence, not to create the world. Whenever we say world, we think about our earth, and that's so limiting. But to create existence, which comprises first and foremost a series of spheroids, in order for any of that to happen, Hashem introduces this new energy called Binah. Binah is going to be highly disciplined. Again, compared to Chokhmah. Chokhmah is not necessarily disciplined. It's just excitement. Binah is disciplined. This is what we're going to study. This is how we're going to study it. This is how we'll flesh out all of these details. Which means that built into Binah, just giving you a little bit of an inkling of where things are going to go down the line, built into Binah is the first inkling of what we call Gevurah. What's Gevurah? Strength, restraint, and discipline. That's in the behavioral experience, and this is in the intellectual experience. Okay, so when a person has a meaningful understanding of something, that is going to guide them to behave in a particular way, right? Which you can understand. That's why, again, if I say the diet starts tomorrow, that's a chokhmah moment. I'm so inspired, I'm so excited, What's going to happen? Yes, the diet will start tomorrow and will end next Monday. Or more likely on Shabbos. Because I don't have the discipline in the intellectual process, so therefore I can't translate it into the discipline of behavior. Whereas when I have the discipline in the intellectual process and I'm starting to truly understand things in a mature way, where everything has its place and everything builds on everything else, that will allow me to have behavior, which is mature and disciplined, and things can build on each other. So I'm just throwing that out as a little bit of an inkling to what's still going to come, which is that there'll be a link between Chesed and Chokhmah and a link between Gevurah and Binah. We're not there yet. What we have to know for today is that Binah is where Hashem introduces an energy that allows specifics. Specifics means there can be an energy called Chesed, there can be an energy called Gevurah, and they'll operate differently. And each one will have its place, and there'll be an interplay between them. All of that is this so-called discipline associated with understanding. So in the human experience, Binah is the unpacking of a brilliant idea into the more laborious process of just understanding how it works in detail with a healthy, mature sense of where everything belongs in the picture. In the creative process, Binah allows the understanding of how this existence is going to work, what all of the moving parts are, how they'll all relate, which are foundational elements, which are secondary elements, and so on and so forth. So can you have chokhmah without binah? Yes. Is there value to chokhmah without binah? No. Can you have binah without chokhmah? No. Because it obviously has to build on an original idea. And yet, even though binah has no, so to speak, life of its own, it depends on the input of chokhmah, it is ultimately what gives chokhmah its truest value and sustainability. So the two have to work hand in hand to have any viable process.
Wow.